In this episode, we're going to discuss how you could accidentally buy a property through not properly understanding how you become contractually bound. Sounds a bit ridiculous, but it is possible. So we've invited a guest expert to explain the pitfalls around forming a contract with the seller of a property.
Welcome to Your First Home Buyer Guide, the podcast for first home buyers who want to move it along and become homeowners. But most importantly, it is for you to become an educated home buyer.
I'm Meighan and that was Veronica. We're both buyer's agents and probably old enough to be your mum. But it's a good thing because between us we've got over 45 years experience to share with you and bucket loads of stories about avoidable mistakes. Together, we're going to make sure you get unbiased and real information you can rely on. Allow us to guide you on your home buying journey. We want you to become an educated home buyer so that you can stop looking for your first home and actually become a proud homeowner.
We've got loads of great tips for you in this episode, and if you'd like more useful tools, head over to the website homebuyeracademy.com.au, and there you'll get access to our free mini course, How to Price a Property Like a Professional. You will also find the holy grail of home buying education, Your First Home Buyer Guide, the online course for people who want to become educated home buyers. We created this for you to help you get on the right path to home ownership for your first home and beyond.
But before we get into the interesting stuff in this week's episode, we've got the boring bit, the disclaimer. You of course know that nothing in this podcast is to be taken as personal advice. We always recommend getting the advice of an expert in their field who takes the time to understand your personal situation. We've done our very best to ensure that the content is correct at the time of recording. Things change rapidly, so always check with the relevant government authority and your trusted advisors to get the most up-to-date information.
Today we're talking about how property buyers can inadvertently be bound by a contract when they really wanted to get out of it. What a nightmare that would be. But before we get into that, what's your special house behind you this week, Meighan, in the video?
What did you say when you first saw it, Veronica? It was some sort
It
of
looked like a submarine.
It's not. These, and I want to be there right now, although I don't think it's the right timing. These are vacation rentals for viewing the Northern Lights up in Lapland in Finland. Can you see that? They are little igloos that are under the ground. The actual bed that you lie in and look up through the glass ceiling are underground. I just think this is phenomenal.
It looks amazing. All I can think of is hopefully the bed is not made out of a chunk of ice, like I've seen some of those igloos. And the other one, because Lapland's friggin' cold in the winter, like frigging cold.
You'd hope there's some heating in there.
And yeah, but they might melt all the ice around you. And the other thing too, they look warm, but what if you go all that way, you go through all that cold, and then you don't get the lights? But anyway, we are talking about much more serious things today. We have a special guest. Richie Muir is a property lawyer and legal director of Lawlab, a conveyancing firm with offices in Sydney, Melbourne, Brisbane and Darwin. Welcome, Richie. Thanks for coming along.
Thanks, Veronica. Thanks, Meighan. Great to be here.
Lovely to have you on. You know, one of the things that we really wanted to talk to you about is you've got some coverage across a number of different states, and we are so careful when we talk to people to remind them that every single state is different. And I think the fact that you've got that coverage across a wide variety of locations is really good for our listeners.
Absolutely. And when I was having a conversation with Richie a few weeks back, we were talking about those differences. And he said something that really caught my attention about how buyers can accidentally buy property while they think they have a get out of jail clause still. We will get to that shortly. But first, Richie, can you start by giving us a quick overview of some of the legal differences across the states when it comes to a contract to sale for property?
Sure. And there are quite a lot of differences. Lawlab has been a national law firm specialising in conveyancing for over 10 years now. So we've had that 10 years, at least 10 years of experience in every jurisdiction. And there are quite a lot of differences. The easiest way to think about the differences between the contracts would be dividing up the country into two. So half the states and territories are vendor disclosure regimes, and the other half essentially buyer beware regimes. So for example, New South Wales, Victoria, ACT, and South Australia are vendor disclosure. So you'd be familiar, Veronica, in New South Wales, there's the prescribed documents that are attached to a contract. And, you know, in Victoria, there's the Section 32 vendor statement. South Australia has a Form 1 vendor statement. In the ACT, there's a lot of attachments to that contract, including building and pest reports. In the other jurisdictions, there's a lot more limited disclosure by the vendors. So, Meighan, you'd be aware in Queensland, there's very limited disclosure for a house sale. There's a little bit of disclosure for units. A disclosure statement essentially sets out the levies and a few basic details like insurance. It's similar in WA, and in the NT and Tasmania, very little disclosure as well.
That's a good way of putting it. It's a country of two different types of ways of the buyer being responsible for their own inquiries. But I think I want to step it back just one bit, Richie. For our audience who are new to the home buying process, can you tell us what the conveyance process is and what you guys do as part of that? So can you really break it down to that really basic level? Why would someone need you, and what do you do?
Well, of course, the exciting part is finding the property, and then after that, you really need to think about engaging a lawyer or a conveyancer. And there's a difference between the two, and difference in practices in the states. But you need to really get that contract reviewed before you sign anything in any jurisdiction, because it can be too late if you leave it until you have signed. And what the conveyancing lawyer or conveyancer will do is everything through to from reviewing a contract all the way through to settling the contract where title is transferred to your name. So the conveyancing process is essentially the legal process of transferring title, but making sure that the buyer is protected along the way so that they know that they're buying the property they think they're buying, undertaking due diligence in that respect, and making sure that the terms of the deal are what they think they are. So that's essentially the process in summary.
One of the things that, we talk to people about a lot is that you do need to get your support crew on board early, right? That is the first step in our process that we teach first home buyers to go through. And that is knowing who you're going to use as a mortgage broker, but particularly as a conveyancer or lawyer. And one of the things that we also know is that sometimes when people take a contract to a lawyer, and I'm saying take a contract because in New South Wales you do get a contract to sale from the selling agent when you're just in the property, and it is slightly different in every state. Like you mentioned, in Victoria's Section 32, etc., etc. In Queensland, for example, there's not much you get from the agent. You just sort of, you get a standard contract to sale, and then you've got to add the bits in to protect you. Yeah. So the thing is that a lot of people, and also Queensland, you can actually waive your rights quite easily, whereas, to a cooling off period, for example, whereas in New South Wales, it's really difficult to waive that right to a cooling off period. But fundamentally, the simple things that we talk about is that people need to get a conveyancer involved often earlier than they think that they need to, because the technical definition of conveyancing is literally just basically taking title from one person to another, right? And yet you really want advice way before you get to that point. And when you're making an offer when you're in a state that you can make conditional offers, you need to get your conditions right and all of that sort of stuff. So I guess when you start explaining to us some of the mistakes that buyers can make here, we know we've got lots of anecdotal evidence and stories about what happens when people don't get the conditions right, or when they sign something and think that they have a cooling off period when it runs out and they've missed out the opportunity to back out. There's lots of things that can happen, right? So do you want to sort of step us through, I guess, from the most risky places to buy property right through the least risky places to buy property? What sort of ways can buyers get unstuck and effectively accidentally buy a property they really didn't want to buy?
Yeah, sure. I think you mentioned something earlier about getting your support team set up from the start, and that's really important because what you don't want to do is spend all the time finding the property, and you get to the stage where you found the right property for you. It's a property of your dreams. And you haven't got your support crew ready. And then you're out there looking for a lawyer or conveyancer to do a last minute contract review. And this could be, you might find it on a Friday afternoon and it's going to auction on Saturday. Or there's the first open house and it's really competitive and you need to put an offer in straight away. So you don't want to leave it to the last minute. You need to get your conveyancer or lawyer identified as soon as possible and have them ready to go. Understand the time frame for them to review a contract, whether that's going to be verbal, whether that's going to be written, whether there's any potential searches that need to be done as part of that process as well. If you go into auction, you want to make sure you do the due diligence before that auction, even inspections, or your lawyer to check a strata inspection report. You want to know the time frame for that. You want to know the cost as well. Obviously, there's usually cost in doing a contract review. It's professional. It's time to do it, at least to do one properly. And sometimes it's just the cost of buying a house. You're not gonna get every one, and there will be some sunk costs. But that's just the process you need to take if you want to make sure you're not signing something blindly, essentially. So moving on to the riskier ones, so in my opinion, WA can be particularly risky. There's no cooling off period in WA. It is, I guess, common practice for there to be no lawyers or conveyancers involved in the contract exchange or the contract signing process. Historically, the real estate agents will handle that. There's what's called offer and acceptance contract, which is essentially a 2-pager with a whole bunch of general conditions. That there is a section to put a finance condition in there, and that is quite common. And it's common to have often 21 days or 28 days for finance. However, that all changes in a competitive market like we're seeing at the moment in WA. So, if you found that the property of your dreams and you want to secure it, often agents will explain to you, well, to be a competitive offer, you might need to think about waiving that finance condition and not putting one in. And of course, you don't have that cooling off period. So that's a risk. It is quite common for there to be what I call industry standard special conditions attached as annexes to the WA contract. So there'll be a good working order clause. There'll be a structural timber and pest condition. But those conditions aren't the same as they are in other jurisdictions. So they're quite narrow. Often the structural conditions are what they say, they're limited to structural defects. So you'll often when the buyer gets their report, there can often be a dispute as to what constitutes a structural defect. And there's often a dispute between the buyer and seller. And, historically the agent stepped in and tried to resolve that, but it can get messy. There can be difference of opinion.
Because, of course, I guess I think, that termite damage is structurally compromised, but someone else might argue that it's not. Or that, you just replace that beam and it's all good or whatever. I guess I can certainly see how that can get into really grey areas, but also the buyer is underrepresented because the agent represents the vendor. So if no lawyers are involved in a situation like in WA, you've actually got nobody representing the buyer at all.
Correct.
And not a lot of seller disclosure.
Until it goes unconditional. So traditionally the process has been that once it goes unconditional, a settlement agent will represent the buyer, but they usually do what they say they do, which is settle it. They don't often do that. I mean, some do for an extra scope service. They can act at the start. Certainly, when we act for WA buyers, we start from the start.
Really?
So we do that contract
That's a
review
real
and all the way through.
eye-opener. Richie, I think that even though we talk at a very high level in the course about understanding the differences between the different jurisdictions, that the risk there, and there are so many, we're recording this in May 2024, and there are so many eastern states buyers buying in Perth at the moment that are going into those transactions with some sort of idea that it's going to be similar to how they've bought in New South Wales or how they've bought in Queensland before, and it's so very, very different. There is so much less coverage there for the buyer.
It is. And if you're making those assumptions and not getting the advice in advance, it can be a costly mistake. You can end up with something that you weren't aware of.
Particularly no cooling off period. I think about Queensland and the agent prepares the contract in Queensland, which is different to the jurisdictions where there's exchange. And one of the pressure tactics that can be used for buyers in Queensland is to say, well, don't worry, you don't need the solicitor to look at it yet. It's got a cooling off period. If anything needs to be changed, you've got that out. It's not really that simple though, is it? When you do have a cooling off period.
It's not, no. I do find though that Queensland contracts are quite buyer friendly in the sense that as long as you do have those conditions favouring the buyer, it is relatively easy to get out of a contract, to cancel a contract if you don't get finance approval, or if your building pest inspections reveals any issues. They're quite broad conditions, as the standard conditions
to the buyer's satisfaction with the building pest, which is quite different to Western Australia.
That's right. But of course, in a competitive market, buyers may be convinced to waive these conditions, which you need to be very cautious if you're doing that. You want to get your reports done prior to signing, and you want to have your inspections done prior to signing. But if they don't have those conditions, then obviously locked in, subject to any cooling off. And as Veronica said, it's a lot easier now to waive a cooling off in Queensland. Years ago, under the previous legislation, you had to get a lawyer to waive it, like you do in New South Wales. But you'll often find contracts that have been signed and it has the cooling off waiver attached to the end of the contract, and the buyer docu-signs that when they sign the contract, or when they make an offer.
So,
eyes wide open. Can you get a solicitor to review the contract before you sign it?
Yeah, but you just gone into something that that I hadn't even thought about talking to you about, but now I think we definitely should, because docu-signing contracts. This is something that really, I guess, has accelerated through COVID. Beforehand, it was very much, we like, particularly in my business, we'd be delivering contracts that had been signed with a wet signature, and they didn't, agents and solicitors didn't even emailed copies of a signed contract. They wanted an undertaking that you delivered the hard signed copy
original
within 7 days, et cetera, right? But then the advent of COVID, and we get used to doing everything remotely, digitally, and DocuSign. And so now a lot more agents have got their contracts in DocuSign. I know that in our business, when we pre-negotiate clauses to a contract that we're going to exchange on, we have a bit of an argy-bargy as to how that gets added into the DocuSign contract. So, and we have to be really clear, and some agents won't add it. You have to sign the contract as it is, and then you have to get these sort of undertakings and all that sort of palaver, and others will add it in, and then they can sign a contract that is actually agreed, all the terms. And as you say too, that when the market is really competitive, so when the prices are rising and the competition is high, all of a sudden all this stuff gets dropped, and buyers are expected to bend over and basically to give up a lot of their things that they would want, right? So with DocuSign, you just said somebody could inadvertently sign something that they didn't even know they were signing. What can go wrong here, and what sort of recourse, and what should people be thinking about when they're signing a DocuSign contract?
Well, they really need to read the contract and understand it before they sign anything, or have a lawyer or conveyance to do so.
Yeah.
And I mean, it's no different to signing anything, really.
It's sort of. Can I just jump in there, because I actually think it is, because it jumps you from one signature to another in DocuSign. It actually,
if you just click through,
you can actually. If you haven't got your wits about you and you're not thinking, hang on, don't just go next, you can kind of skip over things. Whereas hard copies, you're kind of forced a little bit to go through and make sure you see each page. So actually, Veronica, I think you're right. The risk there is a little bit higher that people get a bit complacent and miss bits.
Yeah. What you'll find as well in talking about Queensland is the practice of submitting offers. So a lot of agents will have the practice of, okay, there might be multiple buyers, and they'll send out contracts set up in DocuSign for the buyer to sign those contracts, and that is the formal way of submitting an offer.
Yeah.
And of course, the one that the seller chooses, they will just countersign. So
And then
I
you're
guess
bound.
in a buyer's head, they're submitting an offer, but that offer is capable of acceptance, and then it forms a legally binding contract. So, whilst maybe emotionally they haven't committed it, they think they're just making an offer.
Yeah.
And there's a further process before they get committed. No. If that is accepted on those terms, and there's no counteroffer by the seller, then that is a legally binding contract.
And then you bought yourself a house.
Yep.
Perhaps with no advice around the process that you've just undertaken and committed yourself to.
I would say the majority of buyers in a lot of those jurisdictions don't get advice before they sign.
And,
And we're trying to stop that. We're trying to educate people by having people like you come on here and make sure that you, as a first-time buyer, you understand it is okay to stop, breathe, and get the right people involved at the right time. You don't have to be pushed in to, even in a competitive market, you can stop, you can breathe, you can take your time and make sure you're protected.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, a lot of buyers might understand the worst case scenario as well. If they do get locked into a contract and there aren't any conditions like finance and inspections that they can terminate under, the contract is called unconditional.
Yeah.
And when you've got an unconditional contract and you can't complete, you can't settle, maybe that's because you haven't got your finance lined up, over the valuation didn't meet the price. Maybe you're short of cash, whatever reason. And if you can't settle, then of course that deposit you've paid is at risk. The seller can terminate the contract, keep that deposit, and sue you for damages. That suing for damages is often something that isn't realised by buyers as well. So if the seller was then to resell the property, and there was a loss on the resale, but maybe it's $100,000 less, then they can sue that first buyer for damages. They can sue them for $100,000 as well as keeping the deposit they've paid.
Plus and a lot of people don't know this, if you don't complete on an unconditional contract, the agent can claim the commission from both sales, and that will come back on the buyer as part of the remedy under many of the contract conditions, certainly in Queensland. So there's actually a lot more costs than just losing your deposit, and that's the thing that people think is at risk if they can't complete a contract. It's far more than that, Richie.
Absolutely, yeah. We had one this morning where we were acting for a seller, and the buyer had gone AWOL and refused to pay the balance deposit. And before we terminated, we wanted to check that the agent wasn't going to claim the commission from this sale. But yes, technically, absolutely, they unless we check and they confirm they won't, the agent can claim commission for both sales.
Yep, they have an entitlement.
Yeah, this is interesting. I mean, years ago, like when we first started the Elephant in the Room podcast, was 6 years ago now, we actually did an episode on Australia's most famous property Dumbo, and that was actually on the Tony Collette, what's her, can't remember her husband's name. They bought a
Terrace or something?
No, they bought a property in Bronte in Sydney, and and we went through and went through all the news articles at the time and sort of pulled apart the story as to how it happened. But yeah, they were up for a significant amount of money because the property subsequently sold for less money than they had agreed to pay, and they'd signed on the dotted line and then just decided change of heart. Now, when you got a lot of money, people can be quite cavalier with money. But most first home buyers can't afford to be cavalier with money, and it's well publicised how long it takes to save up a deposit for a home. But I'm actually quite astounded, particularly around off the planned sales, when you do hear people say, oh, well, all I have to worry about is losing my deposit. And I'm like, hang on a minute.
Have you read your contract?
But also, how hard was it to get your deposit? Like, why are you suddenly thinking it's really easy or just let it go? But then, the actual consequences could potentially be a hell of a lot worse. Now, the thing is that, what we find, the conditions that people put in a contract. Now, you mentioned that in WA, there's sort of like standard industry conditions. I'm gathering in Queensland there's probably some standard industry type conditions as well. But, you know, you must have some examples of when people have signed a contract or put an offer in and put conditions in, but they haven't worded them in a way that actually protects them. So they've had the intention, but failed to do it properly.
Yes.
Well, it's not even failing to do it properly. It's just industry standards, industry practice in some jurisdictions. So in WA and the Northern Territory, the inspections conditions, the standard, inspections conditions have a deeming provision, which means, okay, if you have to obtain a report and give notice whether you're satisfied or whether defects, whether you cancel by a certain date, if you don't do so within by that date, then they're deemed to be satisfied, and you can't then later cancel even if there were issues.
Right.
Whilst compare that to Queensland, if you don't advise the seller whether the inspections was satisfactory or not, or whether you got finance or not by the due date, after that due date, either party can terminate and you'll get your deposit back. So that's not such a bad outcome. But as I said, in WA and NT, you lose that right to terminate. So it's really important that you're doing things on time. If you're not going to meet those due dates, then asking for extensions well in advance. Because if you ask for the day of or the afternoon of, the seller may just decide to not respond, and knowing that, well, unless you cancel by the due date, by the 5 p.m. that day, the contract will be unconditional, which is what they want. So it's really important you're ordering the inspections quickly, you're applying for finance quickly, you're speaking to your lawyer or conveyancer, from the get-go. And not waiting until you think you're getting close to finance approval or you've got the inspection report. You need to engage them a lot sooner. It's the same in Victoria as well. There's essentially a 2-day deeming provision. So yes, you've got 2 days after finance inspections to give that notice. But if you don't, once again, it's deemed to be satisfied. There's no comeback after that date.
That's important, the date bit, because I think about the structure of a contract condition in Queensland and the amount of time. So when I was a selling agent, we were discouraged by our agency from writing contract conditions, but I've certainly observed agents in other agencies, even now, who will write contract conditions to go into contracts that haven't got all of the elements of a condition to give coverage, whether that's a date or a remedy or the other. Richie, what are the elements of the conditions?
Well, it's extremely, what you're talking about is extremely common, and it's also illegal.
It's very illegal,
writing,
and that's the bit I want to make sure everyone understands. Don't get an agent to write a condition for you.
Writing special conditions is considered to be legal advice, which means only lawyers and conveyancers can write those conditions. An agent can copy, paste, and insert conditions if they have been drafted by a lawyer or conveyancer. That's okay. And it is common for agents to have a special conditions book or booklet from a lawyer, and they can use those, but they can't amend those. Yes, they can insert a number of days here or a date there. That's fine, but they can't change the substance of those special conditions. But
they need to be written by your solicitor or conveyancer. I think that's really important for everybody to understand. In a conditional contract, it must have been written by a lawyer or
you
conveyancer.
Often see, subject to finance. Well, what does that mean? How long? What happens if they don't get it? Is the deposit refunded? All these things need to be considered. And there might be other conditions like a due diligence condition. There might be a not for first-time buyers, but for subsequent buyers. Might be a subject to sale condition in some jurisdictions,
and they can be complex.
You often find big holes with those.
Well, I mean, again, if let's put our seller's hat on for a moment. If I'm signing a contract with a buyer which has got a subject to sale clause, well, if it's a hot market, I'm not going to do that because I'll only want to go with a buyer that doesn't have that limitation. But B, I'd be thinking, well, how long am I going to wait for you? Because you might have a ridiculous price on your property that is nowhere near, you're never going to get a buyer at that price.
Yeah.
You know, like I'm going to sit there with my property taken off the market, unable to sell it to anybody else while you muck around, you know, wanting $100,000 more than it's worth. So there's all
Or it
of
could
that
be
sort
advanced, Veronica. It could be well advanced. They've got a contract on it with a settlement date and the contract's unconditional. That's less risky for a seller. So there can be all sorts of
There's a
huge
lot of
amount of
different
range in
types
that.
of special conditions where you can have subject to the sale contract going unconditional, or subject to the settlement, or is subject to settlement could take a long time. And essentially it's conditional all the way until settlement.
Yeah.
And that's a situation in some places like the UK where you have these chains.
Oh, they're
I know.
amazing
What
over
a
there, aren't they?
nightmare.
I've heard horror stories in the UK.
You could be waiting for months and months. You know, you could have chains of a dozen different property transactions, and you're waiting on one, and if one person's circumstance in that chain changes, then all the
The
transactions
chain
fall
falls
apart.
over.
I don't know how they operate.
I don't either.
I find
They
that
take their curtains, they take their light fittings. It's so vastly different over there.
And you know, when people from the UK come to Australia, particularly in Sydney, where it's so auction oriented, they're like going, "Oh, I don't know how you cope with this. It moves so fast here." You know, like sort of prefer it to move fast, just quietly. One of the other things too is a release of deposit clause. Now we see that a lot, and when I was a sales agent, yeah, we do.
We don't see it so much in Queensland.
Yeah, so when I was a sales agent, I actually used to suggest that my vendors, so people selling property, would go and talk to their lawyer about adding in a release of deposit clause, and for the pure purposes of knowing that nearly every buyer's solicitor or conveyancer requests that it be removed. So to be the sort of clause that you know, the minute a buyer had taken their contract to a lawyer for review, it's the sort of clause that would make them make an inquiry, which made us know that they were interested. So it was basically like the canary in the coal mine for us. But every now and then, and even as buyer's agents, we know that, you know, it's not advised for most people to have that clause in the contract. Obviously, you don't get it much up there. Meighan,
No.
do you want to explain what it is, Richie, and why it's probably not a great idea for a buyer to leave it in?
Not necessarily. You're right. I think it's because New South Wales deposits generally tend to be 10%. We see more 5% requests these days, just because
we do.
of the
It's a lot of money.
Huge
amount.
median price of a house in New South Wales and Sydney. Whilst in a lot of other jurisdictions it's quite common. For example, in Queensland, it's quite common to see much lower deposits. Usually they're at the amount to cover the agent's commission.
No, yeah, spot on.
So
yep.
Yeah, so it might be
case of default after
$20,000. Yeah.
Wow, that's so tiny.
And so of course in New South Wales, a lot of sellers won't have if they're selling to buy, they won't have 10% in cash. So they'll often request that the buyer's deposit is released so they can then use that to buy their own property.
Oh, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah.
I mean, there are alternatives these days like deposit bonds. They're becoming more popular, which is an essential insurance product for that 10% deposit, and you just pay a fee for that insurance policy. But if there is a clause in a contract with a release of deposit, if it says it's to be released to the seller, it's categorically no. As a buyer, you would never agree to that. But there is often the clause is a draft, or we can request the clause to be redrafted to say the deposit can only be released into the trust account of a solicitor or real estate agent acting, for the vendor of the other property that your vendor is purchasing. So once again, it's held in that trust account
with some conditions or instructions around that.
Yeah, and it can only be released at settlement. So there is a little bit more protection in that extent.
Yeah.
And often that's the middle ground because, the sellers want to buy property and that's the only way they can go in and buy a property, and they won't sell their property to you unless there's this solution. So it is that middle ground. But as being released to the vendor directly, once it's released, it's very difficult to get it back.
That is
even though you have
such good
contractual
advice.
rights.
Yeah,
Yeah.
that's something I really learned today. And I think, to hammer that point home, as a first home buyer, if the seller you're buying from wants to release the deposit, what you're suggesting is it's not a blanket yes, it's not a blanket no, it's go and get advice from your solicitor or conveyancer about the impacts of doing that, and is there a safe way to do it that actually gets your deal across the line?
Absolutely. I mean, there's been media reports, more so in the off-the-plan space, where off-the-plan buyers have released deposits to developers. And of course, after a year or two and the project's not going well, they've gone into liquidation and they haven't been able to recover their deposits.
Such a risky space.
No, it's just risky on so many levels. Yeah. We don't want to go into off the plan today, but we have done a few episodes on the dangers of off the plan. Are there any other ways, Richie, that a buyer could inadvertently buy a property without realising it?
Well, it's really we've mentioned the inspection conditions, but it's also identifying the right property, right? There's been, I've heard of occasions where the buyers actually bought the wrong property. There was a media article very recently where
I've heard of this too.
where I think it was in WA, where the agent got prosecuted because they didn't take reasonable steps to investigate. But I think it was a duplex, and
I didn't hear
lot
this
one was street address. I don't know, maybe it's two, and vice versa. And of course, the conveyancer or lawyer was dealing with it. That they're just going off the number on the contract and their registered plan, and they don't actually see the property. So just really in those kinds of situations, really important that you're identifying the property. Even more so, check out the boundaries of the property as a buyer. So even if it is, in most cases, it obviously will be the right property, but check the boundaries, because the fences aren't always built in the boundary. It's quite common for there to be encroachments. But of course, getting a survey of a property is quite expensive. It can cost you a couple of $1,000.
And can take some time too.
Yeah, that's another issue.
Absolutely, yeah. And there are growing alternatives to these things, like title insurance. Title insurance is a one-off insurance policy that covers things like boundary issues and encroachments, but also unapproved structures on a property.
Is that in all states, Richie?
All states except for the Northern Territory, as far as I'm aware.
The problem with title insurance, though, this is a tricky one with title insurance, right?
No good if you already know about it.
Yeah. So if you do your due diligence and you uncover something, it's a bit of a question mark, and you can't get enough information to clarify one way or the other whether it is or isn't a problem before buying it. So if you suspect and then you go and take out title insurance, then you probably have negated your insurance, right? Because you sort of knew about it. Whereas if you are like totally blissfully ignorant, it's risky, but the way to get the most value out of your title insurance is to do no due diligence, just do title insurance and just hope nothing's wrong. But
that is not a recommendation by Veronica, everybody. That
we're
is
not
recommending
Veronica's
that recommendation.
We're not
but you
recommending
are
that.
presenting a really interesting part of that equation there, Veronica. So it's almost, because we don't see title insurance a lot in Queensland. I know you've talked about it a lot in New South Wales. We don't see it used a lot. But certainly the way that Brisbane was subdivided back in the day in the different subdivisions around the area, a lot of those fences are not on the boundary line. And they could be anything from 30 to 50 centimetres out. It could be in the wrong line. It could have a shed sitting over it. So there are lots of things that can actually happen where the boundary isn't as it looks from above.
Yeah, and of course the legal consequences of that could be, particularly if there's a structure that's on your property that's encroaching on neighbours, your neighbour could apply to either have that demolished, or for the property to be reconfigured, and for you to pay them compensation for transferring that part of the land to you.
Boundary realignment.
Yeah. I mean, I've actually had it personally. Years ago, way before I was a buyer's agent, I bought a house and it had a fence, and the property was rented out for some years, and the neighbours decided they want to get a new fence, so we got a new fence, and it just was put where the old fence was. Yeah. And then I got plans approved to renovate the house, and with it was literally, and got the plans approved and a construction certificate, walked through the property with the builder, the last walkthrough before demolition starts, and I look out the kitchen window and I went, the kitchen's going to get pushed out 1 metre, which is about where that fence is. And I don't recall the house sitting on the fence. Interesting. Realised that the fence for some 20 metres was 1 metre inside my block of land, and had been.
So you had an extra metre.
Ever since I bought it. But it was a bit of a struggle, because the problem is the boundary was actually that the house next door was built on the boundary, and they had all their services bolted to their wall, encroaching on my property. So, and then I was going to cut off their access, and so they wouldn't have I wasn't going to give them a gate to go into my property to go and to deal with their services. So that all had to get moved. So, their hot water and various things they had bolted on the side of their walls. So,
Goodness.
This can happen to me. I was actually in real estate sales at the time, but, I wasn't. It was a long time off becoming a buyer's agent.
You know a lot more now.
I know a hell of a lot more now.
Richie, that has been incredible. Is there anything else? We always have a question that we ask. Veronica will ask you that in a moment. If there's anything that you don't think we've covered that would be really great for first home buyers to at least know, so that they don't make the mistake of inadvertently buying a property or committing themselves to a property that they didn't realise they were committing themselves to?
Well, my other comment would be related to finance, and a lot of first-home buyers don't understand some of the hidden costs in buying a property. And of course, if they don't and they're short, then that's when they could lose that property, lose the deposit. So I'm talking about things like stamp duty. If they don't get the concessions or exemptions, then stamp duty on purchase. Don't assume because you're a first-time buyer, you'll be exempt for stamp duty. LMI if you're borrowing over 80% of the LVR, and then you got registration fees for the transfer. In some jurisdictions, that's based on the consideration. So New South Wales, it's a set fee, fixed fee, $150 or thereabouts. But in Queensland and Victoria, for example, it's calculated based on the purchase price. Okay. So you may need to spend an extra $1,000 or $2,000 depending on the price of the property in transfer registration fees, and that will come off. Usually, your usual lender will practically pay for that, but they'll reduce that from the available finance they'll make available at settlement. And things like adjustments as well. So if the seller has paid for rates for a year in advance, then you're going to have to pay them back pro rata at settlement. So all these things add up, and also even the conveyancing fees. So usually there's a fixed fee for the standard scope of work, plus expenses that cost, and those expenses can vary depending on the searches you do and the amount of due diligence you do. You can go to town and search for everything about property and easily spend another $1,000 or $2,000. So you need to factor all those things in, and often first-time buyers get settlement, and I've been there as well. One of my first homes, getting there, and there's all these little unexpected costs, and you're short at settlement. So try and work those out in advance, and certainly when we do an intro pack to our clients, we consider all these extra costs, because you don't want to leave it till settlement. And because it's settlement, if you don't settle on time, there can be repercussions. You may need to pay the seller penalty interest rates for any delay. And if you don't settle on the due date, the seller can issue what's called a notice to complete or a default notice, depending on the jurisdiction. In Queensland, we've got that contractual 5 business day period extension, right? As long as you extend it before that settlement date. But once those extension periods are completed, if you still can't settle on time, that's when the seller can terminate the contract.
And have remedy.
Exactly.
Yeah. And in a rising market, like particularly as the situation is in Adelaide, Perth and Brisbane at the moment, as we're recording this, the seller is not inclined necessarily to give the buyer any leeway because property prices have probably gone up since they actually agreed on a price. So, market conditions can play into this, that's for sure. Richie, this has been really interesting. Tell us our final question for you, which is one we ask all our guests, is what is the one thing that you know now that you wish you knew when you were a first-time buyer?
Well, I bought my first property when I was a student in Glasgow, Scotland, and I bought it with my brother.
You do not sound Scottish, I have to say.
No, there's no accent there.
I was born in Australia, but we'd moved over there and then I went to university in Glasgow. And I bought with my younger brother, and we used our student loans at the time for deposit on a Glasgow tenement. This was back in 2000, I think it was. And for the price of some of £49,000, it was on the unpopular side of Glasgow. Anyway, it was obviously a very low mortgage. It was cheaper than renting, but every mortgage due date, we had to pay £100 down at the bank. My brother used to disappear, so I used to chase him around town to get him to pay his mortgage dues. So, the lesson here is, if you are buying with someone else, think about a co-ownership agreement. It clearly sets out who is responsible for what happens if one party wants to sell and the other doesn't. And this, co-owning property is becoming more popular.
Yes.
Particularly, I think, for younger people. Get a co-ownership agreement in those circumstances.
That is a great piece of advice, and I think another topic, Veronica, for another day.
I think so, absolutely. Yeah. All right, so quick note, you might think that we cover everything you need to know in these podcasts. A word of warning, we do not. We just scratch the surface here, and if you really want to be an educated first home buyer, you need to learn all of the steps that you need to do and how to do everything in the right order.
Our First Home Buyer Guide course only costs $990, and you get direct access to us to help guide you through your negotiations. You can also share links of any property you're thinking of buying so we can help you work out whether it's an A, B, C or no-go zone property. Trust me, you'll buy better with our guidance, and you'll overpay by a lot more than $1,000 if you don't know what you're doing. In this episode, we've only touched on a tiny part of the huge amount of things you need to know to become an educated first home buyer. There is so much more for you to do. You can learn all of the steps in the right order and avoid all of the mistakes that others have made in our 10-step online course for first home buyers.
If you'd like to learn more about the right process and avoid making rookie errors, become an educated home buyer. Head over to the website, check out your First Home Buyer Guide, the course that we have created for you. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you won't miss an episode. And if you've liked what you've heard today, please give us an iTunes review. It helps other people find us. And of course, I know it's a bit cringy, but we're going to ask for 5 stars. Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. We hope you've found this really useful. And if you have, please share the love with others who you know are in the same boat. We'll be back next week with more priceless stuff.